So, welcome to my channel again. This is Dr. Emmanuel, and I just want us to do a very quick, succinct revision on the gross appearance of the cerebral hemispheres. Essentially, we'll be looking at the convolutions of the cerebral hemispheres, which produce what we call the sulci, which are fissures, and produce the gyri, which are these convoluted convexities we can see. So let's just look at, let me move to this next slide and just start. So the cerebral, hemisphere, or we can say the cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes. So we have the frontal lobe in front, which is, you can see, is almost a half of the volume of the cerebral hemisphere, and we have the parietal lobe, which is directly behind the frontal lobe, and we have a temporal lobe, which protrudes, down anteriorly and inferiorly, and then just at the back of the cerebrum you have the occipital lobe. So let's go back to this one. So this is the lateral view, or the parietal view or lateral view of a cerebral hemisphere. It looks like a left cerebral hemisphere. And that's the frontal pole. So there are 3 poles, or 3 narrowed projections, if I describe it that way. So we have the frontal pole, we have our temporal pole, and we have the occipital pole. This is different from the lobes because there's no parietal pole. Okay, it's not acutely curved at this upper point. So we have just the frontal pole, the temporal pole, and the occipital pole. But we have the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. Here I've highlighted the central sulcus of Rolando. So it's a sulcus, or you can say it's a groove on the parietal, separating the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Very prominent groove there, the central sulcus of Rolando. And just anterior or frontal to this central sulcus is a gyrus, the precentral gyrus, and then just behind this central sulcus is your post-central gyrus. And in front of your precentral gyrus is a precentral sulcus or groove, and just behind your post-central gyrus we have the post-central sulcus or groove. So this is our frontal lobe. The frontal lobe has a superior frontal gyrus, a middle frontal gyrus, and an inferior frontal gyrus. So the frontal lobe has superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus or gyri. Our temporal lobe has a superior temporal gyrus and a middle temporal gyrus and an inferior temporal gyrus. Okay, and it has a superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. Same as the frontal lobe, the superior frontal sulcus, the inferior frontal sulcus. Okay, this is our parietal lobe. So if you look at the parietal lobe, that's where we've talked about the precentral gyrus, the post-central gyrus. We have the superior parietal lobe there, and the inferior parietal lobe. We have the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is the sulcus between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. So the parieto-occipital sulcus. And this is a calcarine sulcus. So by the time you read about the visual pathway, so this is, you find the visual cortex is just around and also includes this calcarine sulcus. So the visual cortex is just there. So it's of importance in vision. So we've looked at, so what the essence of this is not to teach. I'm not here to teach. I'm just here for us to revise. So if you have your exam coming close and you just need to do a quick revision of what the structure of the cerebral hemisphere looks like, you can just watch this video. Just to recap: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. And somewhere right there, if you manage to lift this inferior frontal gyrus up, if you lift it up, you would see another buried convolution of cerebral, matter, which is called the insula. That's it. So the insula is also called the island of Rao. So this insula is also cerebral cortex. Okay, it's just an infolded, convoluted part of the cerebral cortex that is buried underneath excuse me, the inferior frontal gyrus. And this insula this insula has short gyri, has a limen, that's there, has a central sulcus also, and has the secular sulcus, just to mention. Okay, but just know that you've got an insula, which is cerebral cortex buried beneath the inferior frontal cortex, okay, and also beneath the superior temporal. If you lift this superior temporal gyrus and the inferior, so it's just somewhere there, and so you have your insula or island of Rao. So just a brief extract from Wikipedia. The insular cortex is a portion of the cerebral cortex folded deep within the lateral sulcus, which is the fissure separating the temporal lobe and the parietal from the parietal and frontal lobes within each hemisphere of the mammalian brain. The insulae, that's plural for insula, are believed to be involved in consciousness. So they play a role in consciousness, and they're believed to play a role, in regulation of emotions, regulation of homeostasis in the body, things like, empathy, compassion, taste, perception, even, contributing to motor control, self-awareness, cognitive functioning, interpersonal experience, awareness of homeostatic emotions, hunger, pain, fatigue. So the insula is thought to be involved in our psychology, who we are as humans. The limbic system, which you get to learn about, also contributes to that control of our emotions. But this insular cortex is also said to be involved in compassion and even motor control. This is a sagittal section. So sagittal means you divide the brain. If you divide the brain in this way, okay. If you use a knife to divide the brain, and the length of your knife is able to go through the front and the back of the head, if I describe it that way, it gives you a sagittal section. If the length of your knife is able to go through the part, from one ear to another, that will give you a coronal section. Okay, so it's just a way I'm trying to, if you use your dissecting blade, on a cadaver, so just for you to understand what coronal, sagittal, and even transverse would mean. So this is a sagittal section of the brain. It just shows us the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. So this has shown us the outer or the parietal surface of the brain. And just because I didn't mention this, so we have a lateral sulcus of Sylvius. Okay, so we have the central sulcus of Orlando there, and we have the lateral sulcus, which separates the temporal lobe from the frontal parietal. So sometimes you hear things like frontal parietal, which means inclusion of the frontal lobe and the parietal. So the frontal lobe ends somewhere, at the precentral gyrus, and then the parietal begins behind that. And so the frontal and parietal lobes are separated from the temporal lobe by the lateral sulcus of Sylvius. You get to hear this word on Sylvius if you've read about the cerebral ventricular system. You hear of aqueduct of Sylvius. So that's another place where you hear that word, that name Sylvius. So let's go back. Sorry for digressing. Looking at the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, okay, we can see some other convolutions, some other sulci and gyri. So this here is our medial frontal gyrus. So medial is the medial surface, medial frontal gyrus. On the lateral side, we could see we have the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. But on the medial part, we have the medial frontal gyrus. And then we have this long one, which is called the cingulate gyrus. Okay, we have the cingulate gyrus, and just superior to the cingulate gyrus is our medial frontal gyrus. And that's the medial extension of our central sulcus of Rolando. That's our paracentral sulcus. Okay. So of importance, I want to just highlight, you have this tissue that extends from the frontal lobe all the way back to the posterior extent of the parietal lobe. So this tissue here is called the corpus callosum. And this corpus callosum is a bundle of white matter that connects the right and left cerebral hemispheres. So it is a commissure. So a commissure is any connection between the right and the left parts of the brain. So you have this commissure, white matter, called the corpus callosum. Beneath the corpus callosum, you have this other bundle of white matter called fornix. So this is called fornix, and a band of tissue connecting these corpus callosum and the fornix is called the septum pellucidum. Okay, so it has a septum. It's a septum pellucidum. There you can see the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. Okay. So that is the conus. The conus is part of the occipital lobe, just a convolution, which means infolding, foldings, bendings, of the cerebral cortex. So you have the conus, and that is our calcarine sulcus, which we said, houses the visual cortex, the visual area of the cerebral cortex is around the calcarine, sulcus. That's our cerebellum. Our fourth ventricle, which is tent shaped. You can see the fourth ventricle there. Okay. That's the rhomboid fossa, or the floor of your fourth ventricle. So of importance, note the cingulate gyrus, the cingulate sulcus, the medial frontal gyrus. Note the corpus callosum, note the fornix, the septum pellucidum, note your calcarine sulcus where your visual area is, and note that this convolution of cortex in the occipital lobe is called the conus. So you might not necessarily pay attention to everything. So we said this corpus callosum is a commissure, which means it's a communication, white matter communication between the right and left cerebral hemispheres, and we say it's the largest bundle of white matter. And then just in front there, you have the anterior commissure, okay, which is a smaller communication, white matter communication between the right and left cerebral hemispheres. So the corpus callosum, this is also an extract from Wikipedia. The corpus callosum, also called the callosal commissure, so it's a commissure, is a wide, thick nerve tract consisting of a flat bundle of commissural fibers beneath the cerebral cortex in the brain. The corpus callosum is only found in the placental mammals. It spans part of the longitudinal fissure connecting the left and right cerebral hemispheres. So the corpus callosum is the largest white matter structure in the human brain, about 10 inches in length. Anyway, don't really bother about the length. Just know that it is the largest white matter structure in the human brain, and it's a commissure. Okay, which means a white matter connection between the two cerebral hemispheres. We saw longitudinal fissure. We'll see what longitudinal fissure is and where it exists. We'll come to that. Let me just show that now. So the longitudinal fissure, cerebral fissure, is that space between the right and left. The fissure, that groove that exists between the right and left cerebral hemispheres is the longitudinal cerebral fissure. So you have it anteriorly and posteriorly. Okay. So still the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This shows medial and even inferior. So you can see an inferomedial or medio-inferior view of the cerebral hemisphere. You can still see our corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum has 4 parts. It has the genu. Genu means bend or like a knee. So it has this curvature in front, the genu. It has the posterior extent, which is called the splenium. It has the part in between, which is called the trunk. And it has this part called the rostrum. So rostrum is like a head, where something starts. When you hear rostral and caudal. So rostral is like at the top, the head. Caudal is like the tail. So the splenium can be described as the caudal limit or caudal extent of the corpus callosum. So this rostrum is like the head, and then you have the genu, and you have the body or the trunk of the corpus callosum. That's our fornix, and the fornix has a body, has the crus or the cross, and plural is the crura, and we have the column of the fornix. Okay, and that's our septum pellucidum, which is the septum connecting the fornix to the corpus callosum. Okay, and that's our anterior commissure there. Okay, now I want to just mention, this is the temporal lobe. So this is our frontal lobe in front, our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, which has a conus and has our calcarine sulcus. This here is our temporal lobe. Okay, and this temporal lobe, medially, we have our parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, we have the parahippocampal gyrus. Parahippocampal, para means close to, around. So if you hear parahippocampal gyrus, it tells you that this is a gyrus that is sitting or located or sited next to the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is just there. You can see fimbria of hippocampus. Okay, so parahippocampus. The hippocampus is close to the corpus callosum. Okay, it's close to that's your thalamus. This is your thalamus. This is your thalamus here. Okay, this global structure is your thalamus, and close to the thalamus is your hippocampus. Okay, and you have your parahippocampal gyrus. Now, this parahippocampal gyrus extends anteriorly to give you this bulge, this anterior bulge of cortex, cerebral cortex, which is called the uncus. Okay, which is called the uncus. So the parahippocampal gyrus is a gray matter cortical region of the brain that surrounds the hippocampus, and it is part of the limbic system. So the parahippocampal gyrus, also called the hippocampal gyrus actually, is part of the limbic system, which is a system that controls emotions. The region plays an important role in memory encoding and retrieval. So emotions, memory, the non-tangible aspects of being a human being, are controlled by these limbic system. But then we also found out that the insular cortex also plays a role in some of these functions. Now, it's said that asymmetry of this parahippocampal or hippocampal gyrus has been observed in schizophrenia, which is a mental health, psychotic condition. A sparse amount of literature exists to propose a comprehensive overview of the functionality of the uncus, which is this anterior projection there of the parahippocampal gyrus. Now, a study has indicated that psychotic-like experiences were associated with reduced expansion within the uncus between the ages of 14 and 19 in cannabis-using individuals. So this uncus, which is still part of the parahippocampal gyrus, has been implicated in psychosis when there are problems, with that part of the brain. So this is the inferior view, gives us a decent inferior, view of the cerebral hemispheres. So that's our uncus, that's our parahippocampal gyrus. Okay. That's our longitudinal fissure, the posterior part of the longitudinal fissure, the anterior part of the longitudinal fissure. That's the genu of the corpus callosum, and the posterior aspect is the splenium of the corpus callosum. Okay, that's our pituitary gland or hypophyseal gland right there. Okay, and you can see these two small bodies called the mammillary bodies. Okay, they're the mammillary bodies. They are part of the limbic system, the mammillary bodies. That's our olfactory lobe and our olfactory tract, okay, for your sense of smell. And this is an olfactory sulcus. So this olfactory sulcus, if you see, that's where the olfactory tract and the olfactory bulb overlie. So this is an olfactory tract that has been cut for us to appreciate this olfactory sulcus, okay. As the lateral sulcus of Sylvius, right there, lateral sulcus. Okay. In this view, we wouldn't be able to see, we wouldn't be able to see our central sulcus of Rolando, because this is an inferior view. So that's the calcarine sulcus right there. The calcarine sulcus. Okay. Yeah, for vision. Okay. So this is just a very brief. We have anterior perforated substance and we have the posterior perforated substance. So this is just a very quick revision of what the anatomy, the structure of, the cerebral hemispheres looks like. So thanks for being part of this revision. Wish you all the best in your examinations, and I'll enjoy you to read more about the cerebral hemispheres, to study your atlas more, have your discussion groups, and see if you can internalize some of this useful information. Thank you.